All right, so good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, we're all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And I'm particularly excited for today because today we continue an really exciting partnership with the Arctic Institute of North America. Based out of the University of Calgary, they are Canada's first and longest lived institution dedicated to Arctic exploration, education, and science. So thank you so much to them for providing this really exciting partnership and series of programs over the next coming months. So today's talk's a little bit unusual for us. We've never actually covered this topic before, which is really exciting. We are going to talk about food security in the frozen north. So some of our kids today are joining in Toronto and Calgary and major cities across Canada, where you can just go to the grocery store and get pretty much whatever you want from around the world very, very easily. That is not the situation in the north, where it often takes huge transportation chains to get food up to various communities in northern Canada. It can be prohibitively expensive. And so there's many things being done to try and alleviate that problem and make sure that people in northern Canada, Nunavut, Yukon, Northwest Territories have the food resources they need year-round. So Henry Penn is joining us live in the Yukon to explain a little bit about this whole system and these processes. I'm really excited to hear from him, and I look very forward to your questions at the end. Henry, thank you so much for joining us today, and take us away.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who's joining in today. I hope this is going to be interesting, and I'm really looking forward to the questions as well at the end. So my presentation today is going to look at food security and sort of food security issues, the types of solutions that communities and peoples across the north of North America are doing to try and help with food security and improve their sense of food security. And I'm going to basically talk through some of the solutions that they've come up with. I'm going to focus pretty much on northern North America for the purposes of this presentation. I live in Whitehorse in Yukon, and previously I lived in Alaska. So a lot of my work over the last 5 or 6, 8 years has been in these regions. This is certainly not to say that there aren't food security issues in southern parts of North America. That's certainly the case, but for today we're going to focus on the north. So what is food security? It is essentially all aspects of where food comes from, how we access it, how we get hold of it, where we have to go to do that. And so the easiest way to think about it is essentially into two concepts: access and availability. Those are sort of the two cornerstones, that the main pieces of food security in terms of sort of the easiest way to think about it. And so access is really covering all the different areas of how we access food. Is there a store that we can go to? How easy is it for you to get to that store? And where the produce and the food is sold? And what would prevent somebody from being able to get to the store, or prevent somebody from being able to get to a place where they can access and purchase and acquire food? The other side of food security is availability. So is there food available in the places that you can go to get it? Is it the type of food that you like to eat? Is it the type of food that you need to be healthy? And are there any sort of culturally relevant or specific types of food that are very important to one group of people? And again, is that food available for them? So let's look at what food security means in different parts of North America. And for the purposes here, I'm going to sort of very roughly split North America into sort of north and south. So in the north, I'm sort of saying everything in the south is sort of Canadian provinces, the continuous and lower 48 of the United States. And then in the north, Alaska, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and Yukon. But this does also sort of include rough areas of northern BC, northern Alberta, and again, it's a very rudimentary line for the purposes of today, but that's essentially what I'm going to talk about in terms of north and south. So what is food security like in the south? I think this is probably the reality for most of us on today's call. There is food provision in stores, there's local markets, there's essentially just lots of choice. There's access within a short drive, or maybe even public transport. There's maybe some concerns with prices, particularly in sort of the rural south. But broadly, we're connected to the larger global food system, which means that we've got pretty regular and easy access and availability to just about any foods types and food sources that we could want from all over the world. Although I will add, just in these current times of a global pandemic, the global food system has sort of been pushed a little bit, particularly when people have panic bought, or lots of people have sort of descended on the food system at the same time. But I think broadly, food security in the South is a reasonably sort of successful state. Now in the North, there's less choice, maybe only one store per town, certainly longer distances to travel to that store. Prices are a lot higher. The pictures on this slide were taken in Nunavut, in northeastern Canada, and as you can see, sort of $7 almost for some milk, $36 for the toilet paper there. And it's the end of the distribution system in terms of how food is transported around North America and around the world. The communities in northern parts of North America are at the extreme ends of that delivery system. And so if there's any issues, if there's a missed flight or bad weather or mechanicals on trains or trucks, then the food either can't arrive or it takes significantly longer to get there. And which is why you often, you read and you see, and certainly might have experienced, using alternative methods to get food, like hunting and fishing. And that's just one of those ways of increasing food security. And of course, there's a lot of local and cultural ties to those types of activities. And so why is food security a problem in the North? And this is a huge topic. Books and classes and whole educational institutions are devoted to answering these kinds of questions. But for me, there's sort of three big sort of standout challenges and issues as to why food security is a problem. The first is transportation. Simply put, the North is a long way away from just about everything else. And so just to take one example, San Diego to Inuvik in Northwest Territories in Canada, that's 4,000 miles, 6,000 kilometers over 2 days of traveling. And so again, if you've got bad weather, especially in the winter, when roads are even harder to travel. This morning, to get into my office, I had to come through about 8 inches of snow that's fallen overnight, and yeah, the roads weren't great. And so the same is true for the transportation of food. The same is true for distance in terms of making food expensive. If it's got to come a long way, you've got longer flights, more transportation, more fuel, and it means that certain foods are easier to transport over longer distances. So foods that come in boxes, foods that have a longer storage time, are easier to transport and effectively less expensive to transport. And so things like fresh fruit and vegetables are harder to access in northern areas, northern regions, and certainly are more expensive. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, yes, food comes from a long way away to get to major cities in the south. And that's true, but what about the population difference? So I live in the Yukon, and there's about 40,000 people in the Yukon Territory. In Alaska, there's maybe 750,000 people, there or thereabouts. Whereas cities in the south can have 2 million, 3 million people living in them. And so that makes buying food significantly cheaper. You've got larger quantities, and we know that buying larger quantities of anything, you have a sort of economies of scale. It means it's cheaper to buy larger quantities. And then you have the ability to share the cost of all the different distributions. And so the way that I've been thinking about it is to compare it to riding a bus versus being in a taxi. And so lots of people can get on the bus and all move around together. And so the cost of sharing that transportation is quite small. Whereas in a taxi, there may be only 1 or 2 or 3 people in there. And so then they have to share that cost just amongst the 3 of them. So it means it's more expensive. And so that's sort of a way of thinking about food costs in the north versus food costs in the south from a population perspective. The third angle of food security in the north is sort of broadly wrapped up in grocery stores. And so the store has to manage the cost of storing the food, and in some cases refrigerating the food or keeping it to a condition where it can be purchased by people coming. Energy costs in the north are significantly more expensive than they are in the south, and so the simple cost of storing food means it's a lot more of an expensive endeavor. Similarly, living in the north is more expensive than living in the south, and so wages and other things like that are higher or needs to be higher in order to be able to provide the same quality of life in the north compared to the south. And so all of these additional costs and higher costs are wrapped up in the price that you see when you go to the store to buy food, which then, of course, means it's a little higher. So those are some of the issues with food security in northern areas. But I'd also like to talk about solutions, because this is the slightly more interesting, well, I guess the sort of more hopeful part, and the bit that I spend a lot of my time working on. So there's four main areas of ways that communities and peoples in the north are trying to address areas of food security. And the first one is community gardens. You see these a lot across different northern areas. They're typically tied to schools or larger community engagement activities or community groups. And they're a great way to increase the amount of particularly fresh produce that's available in community and in northern areas, again, particularly in the summer. And great way to share food and really kind of build out the ability to access produce for people living in northern areas. Similarly, greenhouses, ever more popular. I see them more and more in different communities in the north, and particularly as greenhouse technology is increasing, they're able to grow more and more year round. You know, we've got greenhouses now in Yukon that are pretty much good for 10 months of the year, which is pretty good considering that we have, you know, still -40 temperatures in the winter and lots of snow and decreasing sunlight availability. They are really good for growing foods that can't typically be grown outside, so tomatoes, cucumbers, things like that. And again, they're typically tied to community organizations or schools or other sort of more communally typed organized groups. The third one is hydroponics, which is a new and emerging technology that's beginning to make a lot of inroads and becoming more and more popular in northern environments. It's the idea of growing produce indoors without sunlight. You replace the sunlight with special lights that provide the plants the same type of light that they would normally get from the sun. You're growing without soil, using little trickles of water to be able to provide the nutrients to the plants and to the crops. And because it's all controlled and it's all indoors and there's quite a bit of technology involved in it, you can grow, for example, lettuce significantly quicker in these types of systems than you can outside. I have one where at the research station that I work at, and so we're able to grow fresh leafy greens and produce and so forth in 30 to 50 days from seeds to harvest, which is quite a bit quicker than you can grow it outside. The other major benefit of these types of systems is that they can be used all year round, so we can produce produce and crops all year round. But they do have an energy component. They are quite expensive to run from an energy perspective. They need energy year round, which, depending on the size of the community and the area you're in, does have some pros and cons in terms of how usable it is. The last area is sort of communities working together. There's lots of smaller communities across Yukon, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Alaska, and transportation between all of them it's there. You know, the communities do move around. There's flights, there's snow machines in the winter or other modes of transportation like that in the summer. And so communities that are growing and expanding the amount of space that they use for growing are beginning to talk to each other and work out networks and regional networks for moving produce around their area and sharing kind of the surplus that they have. And this is beginning to be looked at even more, particularly in these times of a global pandemic, because the connection to the globalized food system is really causing some challenges, particularly at the far ends of the distribution system. And so if there's a more robust, a slightly stronger network of regional food systems around the north, then potentially that means that they are a little bit more sheltered from major changes in global food systems. So that is my run through of food security and food security issues in the north. Yeah, and I'd welcome any questions.
Fantastic. Henry, what a whirlwind tour. Thank you so much, man. And I want to say, in addition to our 5 live classes, we've got groups in California, Michigan, across Ontario, all joining in on YouTube. So welcome into all of you from across Canada and the US to hear this talk today. I really appreciate you joining us. Henry, if you want to come out of screen share so you can see us again, go right ahead and do that. I want to start with a question from YouTube because it's a great question. So this is from someone, and it's, if food costs more, do the people in North get paid more so that they can buy it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Typically, you do see wages in the North to be higher. Now, whether I would say that they are higher to the point that they've covered back the cost of food, I would say it's probably unrealistic. I think I think that's a really challenging point to say. To simply say that because food is more expensive, you get paid more. I don't think it's not that clear cut. I think there's definitely some challenges with how much people get paid versus how much it costs to live in the North.
Yep. Fantastic. Great first question to kick us off, man. All right, we're going to go to Robert Thirsk High School in Calgary joining us. If you guys want to demute your microphones, come on in. Go for it. You guys.
Hi.
Hey.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was wondering, so for the crop boxes, how long does it take for them to be built, and like what kind of challenges are presented by creating them?
Sure, that's a great question. So there's lots of different companies around the north and certainly in southern parts of North America designing hydroponic and more indoor growing systems. The challenges with them, I think I think it's more the economies of scale, if I can phrase it like that. They are typically, and this you see a lot of this, but there's typically designed for southern locations, and so you've got more people, so they design bigger systems. Now, designing systems that are size appropriate for northern locations is certainly a challenge. And then also, of course, shipping the unit to the north. So the system that I work with came from North Carolina, which obviously is quite a distance away from me, and there was costs that were carried because of that. But I think more and more as these systems are coming into the north, people in the north are saying, well, hey, we get what the point of these systems are, but actually we can probably design this a little bit better for where we are and the things that we're after. And so you're seeing more and more northern companies building their own systems specific for the north that are both a little smaller, perhaps, a little bit easier to buy off the shelf equipment that means you can build them sort of by yourself. Yes, that's kind of what we're seeing the transition to now.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thanks, Henry. We're going to go to Ms. Way's class in Toronto in just a second. I just want to note for the other teachers, all your mics are working, so I will come live to you on YouTube. Our class in Winnipeg is sharing a bunch of questions, but if any of our other classrooms want to share questions, please do. We have lots of time for Q&A today, so look forward to hearing from you guys in a minute. All right, Ms. Way's class, just demute your microphone and then come on up for a question. You're good to go. Hey, guys. Oh, you got that thing where you all sound like mice down a well. All right, so your audio is a little off. So Miss Way, if you want to type in the chat bar, we'll say hi and wave to you guys, but your audio is off or we won't be able to actually hear you guys. So share questions in the chat bar and I'll take them in 2 seconds, okay? In the meantime, I'm going to go to Mr. Patrick's class, grade 8 in London, Ontario. Just demute your microphone, guys. In fact, all our teachers, you can demute your mics. You're good to go. I cannot hear you until I bring you in. So Mr. Patrick's, go for it.
We don't have a question just at the moment.
That's fine. If you think of any, let me know. What I'll do right now is share one from Riley in Winnipeg in Miss Forsland's class. How many grocery stores in total would be in a remote community? So you can take this to be a fairly big city in the Yukon, somewhere further up north, Nunavik. What are we talking?
Okay. So I'll take it from one end of the scale to the other, perhaps. So I live in Whitehorse in Yukon, and so we're the biggest city in Yukon, and we have 5 different grocery stores for a population of about 28,000 people. Now, once you head out of Whitehorse and you're into the smaller communities, and this is certainly true of Alaska, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut as well, there would typically be 1 store per community. And so anything around the 1,500 to 1,000 people, all the way down to communities of 150 or 50 people, yeah, there'd be one store per town.
Right. And I'm really glad we're getting a chance to highlight the scale of this. So, I mean, I'm in Toronto and I'm in a far section of Toronto in the corner, and I can think of at least 7 places within 2 kilometers that I can buy groceries, like significant amounts of groceries, anything I'd want to keep me alive for years on end. And so, thank you so much for that question, Ms. Frozen.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Mr. Patrick, you guys have a question now, so come on up. Go for it.
I was just wondering how difficult is it to ship supplies to the north?
Yeah, great question, man, and I love that you would ask.
Yeah, so the three main ways of getting food into the north are airplane, truck, and by boat. And so in Alaska, there's also train, but that's sort of a more different example. In terms of how difficult it is, it's mainly the capacity of the different distribution systems to do it, and at what time of the year you're doing it. And so most grocery stores in the north will be putting their orders in maybe a month to 2 months in advance of it actually arriving in the store. And so then if there's anything that goes wrong in that time, the truck breaks down, there's a bad weather event, something like that, and again, this is particularly true in the winter, then it can be another month or so until those groceries arrive, because they have to wait for the next plane schedule in terms of being able to get the food to the community. And so I think the system works pretty well when it works. But again, I think it's there's certain times of the year and specific incidents where it can really be very difficult to get food to communities.
These are some really thoughtful questions, guys.
Yeah, really
good. Off. So Ms. Weissmiller and Ms. Hannah, I will come to you guys in a minute. Ms. Way's class, I'm going to bring you back in just to say hi. I know your mic isn't on, but Sage has a great question for you, Henry. Is there more hunting in the north because the food from the grocery store is so expensive?
Yeah, I would say that's a very true statement. I think folks in the north do rely on hunting and fishing far more than is perhaps normal in the south. Again, because food is so expensive, and I think particularly any sort of fresh food, so your meats and your produce, so lettuce and tomatoes and things like that. I think people spend a lot more time again hunting and fishing, but also growing their own to supplement what they can get in the store.
Yep.
It's a great question.
This is a great question. Thanks, Miss Way's class. Thanks, Sage. All right, Miss Hannah's class joining us in Woodstock. If you guys have one for us, come on up.
Hi.
Hey.
We were wondering, does it cost, do you save money by growing things through hydroponics and greenhouses up north versus having them transported?
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question. I think on the hydroponics front, we don't really know yet, because obviously one of the big components of growing things in a hydroponic system, or really growing any food in an indoor environment, is that you have the additional cost of energy. And I think it's still a little unclear exactly what that does in terms of either increasing food costs or decreasing them. On the front of doing greenhouses and community gardens, I would say it's not necessarily so much about reducing the cost, one lettuce versus another lettuce. I think it's more about the quality of the produce that you're able to get. And so if you think, actually, I was in the store yesterday and I bought some fresh produce, and it had come from San Diego, and it had come from other parts of the lower 48 in the US. And so by the time that it arrived in the store in Whitehorse, it's traveled those 6,000 miles. It's probably been picked a little early, just to mean that it sort of matures almost on the way. And then by the time it arrives in store, it may be questionable exactly how good the produce is when it's actually arrived, exactly how good the quality is. Maybe some of the nutrients aren't there anymore. And so if I can grow in a greenhouse or in a community garden and don't have to access from the store as much, I think if the cost almost balances out, the quality is, of course, much better.
Yeah. That's a really, really important point, and again, one that we don't typically talk about in any of our sessions. I mean, for me personally, Ontario strawberries so much better than the California strawberries,
Right.
and I'm sure when they're in California, they're great. But that's a big difference that we don't often think about here in Toronto and Calgary and Montreal and major hubs in Canada, but that you guys have to deal with. So that's yeah, great question, guys. All right. Miss Weissmiller's class, so they're joining us in Toronto, grade 9 AP Geography. Just demute your mic, come on up, and then we'll do a whole other round of questions. Here we go. Should be all
I don't
set.
know if, hi, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm not trying to get my kids in here under Google Meet to actually talk, but a few questions that we have, we're going to do 2 or 3. I hope that's okay. The first one is from a student named Lauren, and Lauren is wondering could we ask if the Canadian government has done anything that has actually had a positive impact? Okay, so has the Canadian government done anything that has had a positive impact on the situation? And then the second question is from a student named Effie, and she's wondering what role has coronavirus played in terms of affecting food inequality and food security in the Arctic? Sorry, I have a 2-year-old here too.
It's all good.
Okay.
Those are great. Those are 2 great questions. Okay, so on the first, on the Canadian government, I would say from a Yukon perspective, I would say that the Canadian government is heavily investing in food security and food security issues, particularly in the north. There are a variety of different funding options and sort of funding pots that businesses, local communities can access, and this is everything from being able to start community gardens all the way through to, you know, sort of more larger business industrial size projects that look at food security. I would say that there are still missing pieces exactly in terms of how easy it is for communities to access these pots of money, and certainly they're competitive in the sense that there's only so much and they can only go so far. But I would say that food security is definitely both on territories government, so Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, and food security is definitely a big scientific and research interest of the current Canadian government.
Yeah.
On the point about coronavirus, I think it's a really interesting question. Yukon, we've been very, very lucky so far. We've, you know, certainly compared to other parts of not just Canada, but North America more widely, we haven't had the major outbreaks that have been seen elsewhere. I think one of the things that was noticeable, you know, right away when the pandemic started and people felt like they just wanted to double check exactly how much food they got at home, and maybe they bought an extra couple of packets of this and that and everything else when they went to the store, that really tested the food distribution system. You know, stores are, as I said, buying 1 month, 2 months in advance. And so when you suddenly have a burst of people coming into the store to buy things that maybe wasn't expected, then you still have to wait those next 2 months before the produce and other foodstuffs and just store things in general arrive back again. And so I think that has definitely been a challenge. You know, you sort of notice little things like the head of broccoli in the store goes from being sort of this big down to being this big because the store is trying to make it last a little bit longer. I think now everything's kind of leveled out a little bit. People have sort of got the hang of what they're doing. It's got better, but definitely any shocks in the distribution system cause major issues.
Yep. Great questions, Ms. Weissmiller's class. All right, we're going to take one from YouTube, and then we're going to go back to Mr. Thirst's class in just a second. So Van City Band on YouTube wants to know, how do other northern countries, Nordic countries, Russia, deal with the challenges of Arctic food security? Is it similar? Is it very different? Anything you can share?
From what I know, I think it's similar. You know, distribution is always going to be an issue. Doesn't matter whether you're in Canada or the US, Russia, Scandinavian countries. It's always that distribution system. I think the methods for addressing food security are very similar. I've colleagues in Scandinavia who again work with hydroponic systems and help establish community gardens and greenhouses and so forth. So I think much of the same issues do exist. I think perhaps there's a slightly more in some northern countries, perhaps some of the cultural pieces that historically have addressed food security are in better shape than they are in northern Canada or northern Alaska. But it'd be very difficult to put a finger on exactly why or if that is exactly the case. That's just sort of a more of an outline guess, I suppose. But I think those distribution pieces certainly are still the same.
Yeah. Fantastic. These are great questions, guys. All right, Mr. Lace class, Robert Thirsk, with the Firefly and Batman signs on the wall, which are awesome. If you guys have a second question, go for it.
How has food security up north affected you personally?
Yeah,
that's a great question. It definitely took a little bit of time to get used to. As you can possibly tell, I'm not from Canada. So when I moved to North America about eight or 9 years ago, it definitely did take a little bit of getting used to going to the store and maybe not being able to get the exact thing that I thought I was going to be able to get. Learning to do more sort of on the land hunting and fishing, or being involved with people that are doing those types of activities, and learning to fill my freezer and doing those kind of activities, I think is definitely been different. And then I think, being more in tune with the seasons, getting the hang of growing some of my own food, and understanding that in the winter maybe stuff's going to be a little bit more difficult to get hold of. Prices are going to be a little bit higher than maybe I was used to before I started certainly engaging in this work and being in North America. I think just living in these parts of the world definitely gives you a different perspective of food security more generally.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Henry. And again, it's really nice when we can get personal questions like that. Does not happen very much. This is great. Miss Way's class, type in another question in the chat bar. I'd love to take another from you guys. Mr. Patrick, I'm coming to you guys next. If you have another one, great. If not, just let me know and we'll go down the line. So Mr. Patrick's group, any more questions? Just give me your mic, let me know, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, we have one more.
Cool.
Are processed foods less common up north?
Yeah.
That's a great question. You know what? Processed foods are far more common in the north. And the main reason for that is that they have a longer shelf life. So they last in the stores a lot longer. They are in boxes, which means you can pack them into the kind of the size container that you need to be able to put them on a plane or put them on a truck. And so they ship a lot easier. They typically don't need refrigeration. And so when they're in the store, you just need a sort of normal stock room that costs less energy to keep at a temperature. And so one of the big issues of food security in the north is the availability of processed foods and foods that aren't that great for you versus the availability of fresh, healthy foods that are, one, harder to get hold of, and two, more expensive when they are there. So that's definitely one of the pieces of food security that gets a lot of attention, particularly from people studying this area.
Yeah, a really great follow-up to that from Victoria Pizzatelli on YouTube. Are there ways to access organic food in the north? So if you're concerned about that, things that are,
Yeah, so again, this comes back to the community garden and the greenhouses. This is one of the major ways to get organic produce in the north. And it, depending on the size of the community, and it definitely expands out quite quickly. Once you've got, half a dozen, 10 different people running greenhouses, or you've got community organizations running greenhouses, then suddenly you sort of have the capacity to run a market once a week or once a month. And then more and more people can get involved and start purchasing the organic vegetables and organic produce. And so especially in the summer, you do see this a lot in a lot of different communities as a really great way, one, to build community engagement and have lots of different people getting involved with growing, which is just a lot of fun. And then also to be able to access that organic produce.
Yeah. This is great, guys. All right, Faye in Miss Way's class for Cheap Poetry of the Day. She wants to know how much money people spend on food each month. So this is going to differ per person, but maybe you can speak to as a proportion of your income. So compared to how much you make, how much people spend versus other places. Yeah,
and again, it does depend very much on person to person, household to household, and then also region to region. I've heard and seen estimates anywhere from 20% higher in the north compared to the south, through to things like 50% of overall monthly income spent on food. And so it very much depends exactly where they are in the north and what it is that they're attempting to buy.
Yeah. Great question, guys. All right, Miss Hannah's class, I'm going to come to you guys in a second to wrap us up. I love this question, again, from Victoria. How is the health of people impacted by this amount of processed food, by the relative lack of some healthy food options? Do we have research on this or data on this?
Yeah, so this is getting a little, the health pieces are getting a little bit outside of the area of research and kind of studying that I do. But certainly there are significant health challenges with people only being able to purchase processed foods, or not being able to access as many fresh foods as we need. There's also a more it's a more complicated picture, referring to things like the impact of processed foods versus culturally relevant foods. So things that have replacing processed foods with traditional foods that have been hunted or fished, or things like that. There's health issues that go into there as well. But I think as a general statement, the prevalence of processed foods versus fresh foods in northern locations does have some significant health impacts.
Yep. Great question, guys. All right, we're going to wrap up with one from Miss Hannah's class. If you guys want to come up and go for it.
Hi, yes, we kind of have two questions. The first one you kind of touched on. Taylor would like to know if or how long approximately it takes for some of the produce to leave where they are, meaning like you were talking about, I think San Diego you said, to get to where you are, like in terms of time frame. And then the other question that we had was Ashlyn was wondering, sort of along the same lines as you were just talking about, is there any difference in nutritional value when you are when you're growing the foods in the greenhouses versus them coming from different locations around the continent?
Yeah.
Okay, so on the nutritional quantities, certainly there are differences between either it being grown in community or being transported. Typically, you see a lower nutrient load when it's had to be transported long distances. And one of the reasons for this is certainly that there's nutrients lost during transportation, but also that typically produce will be picked earlier, so that it can effectively ripen during the course of transportation. And so again, say something like a head of lettuce has not gained all of the nutrients that it would have done in a full growing cycle before being picked, if it's been picked early. And then the first question on transportation, again, very much location dependent, but anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks would be a normal transportation time for sort of lower northern ends all the way up to the sort of extreme northern ends. And so again, this is one of those complicated pieces that link the transportation of fresh produce versus the transportation of boxed processed foods.
Yeah. Again, quite the questions, guys. This has been amazing. I did lie. Ms. Weissmiller, you guys have been typing in a bunch of questions in the chat bars. If you want one more question, come on up, and then we'll wrap up from there. So, Ms. Weissmiller, go for it.
Okay, so there's one here about a student named Maya. Do people who have specific diets like vegetarian or halal have more help when it comes to having access to the food they eat? And then we had a question about the Inuit food guide and like what role that plays, because I know they have a unique one.
Yeah. And so I'll do the special diets one first. I don't have, like, I'm not a vegetarian, or I'm not somebody that eats halal products. But certainly from my experience of friends who do have diets such as those, it's a little bit more challenging to get everything that they would again normally be able to get in southern locations. It's definitely possible. In Whitehorse, we're very lucky that we have some independent shops that are quite good at getting that kind of produce and foodstuffs. But certainly specific diets are a bit more of a challenge in the north compared to the easy availability of them in the south. And then on something like the Inuit Good Food Guide, those types of guides are really excellent. And in a lot of cases, they're developed with folks in northern communities, with local governments, with real consultation with northern peoples. And so I think they do have a really useful role. And I think one of the roles that they do have is really addressing certain issues of food security by pointing out the fact that, in the guide, people want to eat a certain way, or or have a wish to eat in a certain way, and then obviously they maybe are not able to do as much of that in their community or in their part of the north. And so I think those sort of government-led policies and programs are, again, just another way that the Canadian government engages. But I do think they have a useful role.
Henry, before we wrap up for the day, is there any last message you'd like to share? We've covered so much between your talk and the Q&A. It's been amazing. But is there anything you want kids to go home thinking about when it comes to food security in the north?
I think the broader topic of food security, I think it's always great when people try and eat as seasonally as possible, to really consider how far their food has come when they are making decisions about what it exactly is they're going to eat. And yeah, if there's any more questions, I think my contact details are probably somewhere, or I certainly can make them available to any more questions. And I'm really excited that so many folks wanted to engage on this topic, because it's one that I find really interesting, and I think it's one that maybe not as well used in the South, and maybe not everyone gets to hear so much about it. So thank you everybody again for joining in.
Yeah. Again, we had 250 plus kids, Manitoba, Alberta, BC, Ontario, California, Michigan tune in today, which is wild. So thank you so much for this. If people do have more questions, get in touch with me at jesse@exploringbytheseat.com or our basic Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants email, and I'll pass along questions to Henry, and you guys can keep the conversation going.
Absolutely.
Address again, Arctic Institute partnership, so arctic@ucalgary.ca. We'll be doing many more programs over the coming weeks with them, so do stay tuned. And Henry, what we do at the end of every broadcast, I'm going to bring in our classes that are remaining before they have to go to lunch. So Robert Thirsk High School, Mr. Patrick's class, Miss Weissmuller's class. If you guys want to join me in saying a big thank you to Henry for joining us today, you're all in. Go for it. Thank you.